A dividend is a corporation's distribution of earnings to its shareholders. What if, instead of giving the money to a shareholder directly, the corporation uses it to provide a different economic benefit to the shareholder? Is that also a type of dividend? The Eighth Circuit addressed this question in Sullivan v. United States. William Sullivan was the only shareholder of a corporation that owned a car dealership. Sullivan hired Frank Nelson to manage the dealership, and Sullivan and Nelson signed a buy-sell agreement. A buy-sell agreement establishes how a shareholder's stock will be distributed if the shareholder dies or leaves the company. Under this agreement, Nelson could buy stock in the dealership. But whenever Nelson's employment ended, Nelson had to sell the stock to Sullivan at an agreed price, and Sullivan had to buy it. Nelson purchased 38% of the corporation's stock. When Nelson resigned from the dealership, he offered to sell his stock to Sullivan as agreed. At that point, the stock's price was approximately $200,000. But Sullivan didn't buy Nelson's stock. Instead, the corporation redeemed the stock, meaning the corporation bought Nelson's stock and held it as treasury stock. After this transaction, Sullivan was the corporation's only shareholder. The Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, determined that the corporation's redemption purchase was a constructive dividend to Sullivan. The IRS argued that Sullivan had avoided paying Nelson $200,000 as required by the buy-sell agreement, yet Sullivan still ended up as the corporation's sole owner. Thus, the transaction benefited Sullivan financially. Further, to provide this benefit, the corporation spent $200,000 that otherwise could have gone to dividends, giving Sullivan an indirect or constructive dividend that was considered taxable income. Sullivan paid the taxes on this extra income and sued for a refund. Sullivan argued that he hadn't been required to buy Nelson stock under the buy-sell agreement, and therefore that the corporation's purchase hadn't benefited him economically or otherwise operated as a constructive dividend. Sullivan claimed the corporation had merely compensated Nelson for his managerial work, which was a legitimate business reason for the redemption. The district court ruled that Sullivan had been contractually obligated to buy Nelson's stock, the corporation's payment of Sullivan's financial obligation was a constructive dividend, and Sullivan owed income taxes on that dividend. Accordingly, the district court denied Sullivan's refund request. Sullivan appealed to the Eighth Circuit.